Sanitize, social distance, and wear masks. That's what our daily lives consist of due to COVID-19. Now, 12 Wits University master's students have penned a paper titled COVID-19 and Vaccine Inequalities in South Africa, the second year. The paper looks at the challenges of COVID-19 and what can be done. Kanyisile Mapalala and Jonathan Govender are two of the students who wrote the article. They join us now live. Thank you so much for your time, guys. We appreciate it. We all know that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. So the reality of this being evident during this COVID-19 pandemic is something we expected. But you delved in much more than the general public would have. Kanyisile, we'll start with you. What did you find when it comes to the inequalities and how poorer people are suffering even more because of this pandemic?
Good evening, Shahan. Good evening, South Africa. What we found through our reflections is that as medical anthropologists, we look at the social experience of illness. So we look at accessibility, we look at the perceptions around illness, around health seeking, around vaccination. And what we found is that perceptions around the vaccination and influences around how people perceive illness have a large influence on health-seeking practices. So it's echoed very clearly in our paper how race influences how we navigate our daily lives. Race influences how we interact with medical spaces. So through our reflections, we basically looked at a lot of different fundamental areas such as accessibility, such as structural violence, such as systemic inequalities, and how all of these come together and influence the social experience and the health-seeking practices of the everyday South African.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, the reality is, and government has admitted this with the Pfizer vaccine, that because it has to be stored at minus 70 degrees, it's going to be hard to get it out to rural areas, which right now means unequal access to vaccines in South Africa. Let's talk about that a bit more and what you found when it comes to vaccine accessibility in this country.
Good evening, Shayan, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on this paper. As you mentioned earlier, the historic past of South Africa has got a lot to do with the way that vaccine and the COVID-19 virus is actually perceived. As my colleague has mentioned, there's a distance from the actual vaccination sites, which makes it quite difficult for people to be transported to these places. And also, as you have mentioned, the point of the storage facilities that are required. Most government hospitals in the metros don't have facilities to do that, so that is store the vaccines. So moving these vaccines to the rural areas and to the people that actually need it is going to be quite a challenge for government and the health department at large. So what I found in my research and speaking to the public is that they have their own perceptions of the virus, which actually creates some sort of resistance to the uptake of the vaccination. And that is something that the health department and researchers also need to focus on in the future.
Yeah. You know what I found very astounding, Kanyisile, and it was the experience in Soweto. And the paper says conceptions of the coronavirus vaccine highlight the legacy of apartheid in Soweto, triggering a mistrust of white people and a kind of general trauma. So that, for me, is something that I need better explaining. How do you come to this conclusion?
So my colleague Dineo Mtetwa situates us in Soweto, and her reflection looks at the perceptions around vaccination, and this is derived from documented histories of vaccines and vaccination perceptions and the experiences of Black people and African people. So she highlights a big mistrust of biomedicine, Western medicine, and biomedical practices. And in that, she makes a link to how narratives around medicine and narratives around biomedicine especially are shared and are experienced by her community, we can say, and our community. And I guess, speaking on her behalf, I would say to better understand her reflection, we'd have to really look into how we understand vaccination. And that goes back to something my colleague just said about the difference between resistance to vaccination and vaccination resistance. And there's a big difference because that goes back to how we talk about vaccinations, how we talk about illness experience, and the role of how we perceive illness to look like. So in Dinella's reflection, she makes a very interesting point in looking at trauma and the linkage to trauma and past traumas. So she shows that we can't ignore our history. We can't ignore the structural violence and how it's perpetuated, because that has a big influence on how we understand vaccines, how we understand health right now. So it's important to look into and understand how catastrophic events such as apartheid, such as social injustice, structural injustice, systemic, the perpetuation of systemic inequalities, how all of these influence our understanding and our feelings towards vaccination.
Yeah, and I should have said generational trauma, because that's what she actually referred to and which you have referred to. So, Jonathan, there's mistrust clearly among poorer South Africans when it comes to a government vaccinating them and how they are dealing with this pandemic, because poorer people have suffered more than those who are rich, and we know that for a fact. So just talk me through what people are saying about their trust or lack thereof when it comes to our government.
Just to expand on what my colleague has already begun to say, the people that are residing in the rural areas have got mixed feelings about the purpose of the vaccine that has not been clearly communicated to them, or even if it has been clearly communicated to them, it's not been communicated in a way that's palatable to them, that makes sense to them, where they can actually see the value of the vaccine. So what has happened is we have found that people have now looked at alternative forms of medicine, looking at traditional forms of medicine, and looking at also seeking other drugs which were previously illegal in South Africa, like the drug that comes to mind that is now being put through for approval to be used on a trial basis is ivermectin. Lots of people have been using that prior to it actually being approved for use in South Africa. So we see that there's a progress or an advancement towards the alternative forms of medication as opposed to what is being provided for in the government. There's also fear around non-citizens of South Africa, those that are seeking asylum, for example, and refugees, based on what the president has said, that they are going to be documented. So there is a fear that they might be deported or they might be sent back to their countries, and some of them would not like to do that. So there's obviously a resistance from that front as well.
I am an optimist, so I'm going to ask you lastly, Kanyisile, if you found any optimism among the people you spoke to.
Well, the optimism, I guess, is the comedic feature, I guess. I wrote on comedic relief, and the special and intentional South African brand of humor and how we use humor to negotiate frustration safely, and how we use humor to navigate the kinds of frustrations we're dealing with on a daily basis. So I think that's the positive, I guess, that we are able to laugh during this very painful and trying time, and we laugh because we're trying to. That's how we shield ourselves safely. Yeah.
I guess it's worrying that you had to dig so deep to give me some optimism around this, but that's the reality for many South Africans, right? We're an unequal society, and the majority of the population is not very happy with the way this is unfolding. Thank you so much for your time and the work you're doing. Really do appreciate it. That was Khanyisile Mapalala and Jonathan Govender, master's students, of course, at Wits University.